Now, there are many ways to win in Dynasty, especially when you consider all the different formats, the scoring systems, the rules, the unique settings that make Dynasty super cool and super fun to play. But I think that I've found a template that is the best strategy and overall roster construction to put you in the best place to win your Dynasty leagues year over year. It's a strategy that I've used now in 2 leagues that allowed me to win back-to-back championships in one league and win 2 championships over the last 3 years in another. So let me show you how I build my rosters to win my Dynasty leagues. Let's first take a look at my back-to-back championship roster because it really hasn't changed much over the last 2 years. This is a 10-team Superflex league with regular PPR scoring, no extra premiums or anything like that, and we only start 9 players. My quarterbacks this year were Lamar Jackson and Jaden Daniels as my weekly starters with Kirk Cousins and Jameis Winston on the bench. My running backs were very plentiful with Josh Jacobs, Aaron Jones, Tony Pollard, Brian Robinson, J.K. Dobbins, Tyrone Tracy, Rico Dowdle, Jordan Mason, and Tyjae Spears. My wide receivers to start out the year were CeeDee Lamb, Amon-Ra St. Brown, A.J. Brown, Tyreek Hill, Rashee Rice, Josh Palmer, and Dontavian Wicks. And then my tight ends were Mark Andrews, Jake Ferguson, Chig Okonkwo, and Luke Schoonmaker. And that was my roster for basically the entire year. I only ended up making 1 trade during the season at our trade deadline, which was just sending away Tyreek Hill to a guy who was trying to make a playoff push for his 2025 first and Brandon Ayuk. So now I have Brandon Ayuk instead of Tyreek Hill. And I also have the 1.05 because he lost in the first round of the playoffs. So I like that a lot. And this was also pretty much the exact same roster that I had in 2023 when I also won that year too. The only difference being that I obviously didn't have Jaden Daniels yet. So my quarterback 2 was Kirk Cousins while he was healthy. And then when Kirk Cousins got hurt, I mainly used Rashee Rice in my Superflex spot to end the year because of how amazing he was to finish out that season. But looking at this roster, there are some takeaways for the overall build of this construction. Obviously, yes, it is a stacked roster, and no, this is not a potato league because 2023 was my first championship in this league, and we've been playing since 2016. It took me so freaking long just to win a championship in this league. But back to this main roster, we have some key points there. Number 1, because it was Superflex, I did go after at least 1 elite quarterback, which is why I went after Lamar so hard in trades that I'll get to in a second. I did also have Joe Burrow this offseason, but I sold him for Jaden Daniels plus before the season started because I believed that much in Jaden Daniels, and now he's an elite quarterback too. But I usually want to have at least 1 elite guy, then I maybe fall into another elite player, kind of like I did Daniels here, or I can just Frankenstein the QB2 spot like I did in 2023 with Kirk Cousins and then Rashee Rice. But the main area that I focused on was the wide receiver position. Even in a Superflex league, I think the wide receiver position is the most valuable group as a whole for Dynasty Fantasy Football because it is largely the most predictable in terms of who will be the best players at the position each year. Those players typically have a ton of longevity that once they enter that upper echelon for fantasy, they usually stay there for multiple years, which also adds into the predictability-ness of it. And that is why I went so hard building out a positional group that includes 4 top 16 wide receivers valued on Keep Trade Cut right now, 2 of which are basically top 5 or 6 in CeeDee Lamb and Amon-Ra St. Brown. Not only do these wide receivers have a ton of dynasty value and are going to hold that value for years and years and years, they also all have that elite production too as perennial top 10, even top 5 fantasy players at the position. And the fact that I have 2 or even 3 hammers on the same team is absolutely insane. Plus another couple really high upside players in Rashee Rice and Brandon Ayuk now once they return from injuries. Looking at how I acquired these players, I went through a big rebuild after a 7-7 season in 2021. I purposely rebuilt in 2022 and I just started collecting any and all draft picks I could. Didn't matter what year, I bought whatever I could in 2023, 2024, and even 2025 back in that season. I actually had Lamar Jackson back then that I then traded away for CeeDee Lamb, Joe Mixon, and a 2023 first and 2 seconds. I then flipped Joe Mixon for DJ Moore in a second. I sold off of Darren Waller for a 2025 first. I sold DJ Moore then for a 2025 first too. And after a whole offseason of just wheeling and dealing all of these draft picks, I had a plethora of ammo to start making moves. I started by rebuying Lamar Jackson and Amon-Ra St. Brown for 3 first-round picks and an extra second. I bought Tyreek Hill and Aaron Jones for Chris Godwin, Travis Etienne, and a first-round pick. And then the big one was moving 4 first-round picks and a second for Joe Burrow and A.J. Brown. And just as the extra cherry on top, I was a big Rashee Rice fan coming out of college, so I drafted him in the late second round of our rookie draft, which was absolutely a hit. So in essentially a calendar year, I sold everything, then bought a ton of it back to go from second to last in the league in 2022 to first in 2023. Now, usually selling a bunch of picks, including first round picks, is not really viewed as a good thing for rebuilding teams. But when you had as much draft capital as I did, I reinvested it into the most valuable positions and players in Dynasty Fantasy Football: quarterbacks and wide receivers who had elite production, and with that production came elite value that will hold for multiple years. And while I was busy buying and selling players and picks to form out my quarterbacks and wide receivers, you may have also noticed that I was also sneaking in some running backs where I could in these deals. I snuck J.K. Dobbins into the Lamar and Amon-Ra deal. I snuck Aaron Jones into the Tyreek Hill trade. I snuck Brian Robinson into my Burrow for Jaden Daniels trade. And all the while, I was churning out my bench with late round rookie picks and waiver wire handcuff options that I got value out of over both years. I drafted Tyjae Spears in the 3rd round in 2023. He's been very helpful at times throughout both years. I drafted Tyrone Tracy in the 4th round of rookie drafts this past year. I added Rico Dowdle off of waivers when Zeke left, and then he was the handcuff to Tony Pollard, then just kept him for 2024 and he became the starter. I added Jordan Mason off the waiver wire this offseason when he was still even the 3rd option behind Elijah Mitchell. Then Elijah Mitchell got hurt, Christian McCaffrey then got hurt, and I had myself an extra starter in Jordan Mason. Tony Pollard's actually just been on my team since 2019. I just had him as a handcuff to Ezekiel Elliott, then became the 1B to Zeke, then he became the starter in Dallas, and then the starter in Tennessee. I just never really traded him or dropped him. I've had him for that long. I did buy Josh Jacobs outright for Jackson Smith-Njigba, who I drafted at 1.06 in 2023. That trade was done in October of 2023 as I was pushing for a championship. JSN wasn't really looking all that good. That one does kind of hurt now looking back on it with how great JSN is now, but I'm also not mad about having Josh Jacobs either. So you win some trades, you lose some trades, everything kind of equals out, or hopefully you'd have a net positive at the end of it. But this has always been my approach to running backs in Dynasty. I ask myself, how can I roster as many guys as I can for as cheap as possible? Players who are either cheap starters right now or maybe have a quick path to being a starter as a handcuff that I can use for a week or two, or maybe more, like I did with Jordan Mason this year. By intentionally going after multiple elite wide receivers, that allows me to keep my wide receiver depth as lean as possible to then roster a ton of running backs and have as many darts as I can at startable guys. Then as for tight end, just kind of comes whenever you can get it. I traded a 2nd round pick for Mark Andrews prior to the 2023 season, so he was my weekly guy for my first championship year, then was kind of my weekly guy to end 2024 as well. I don't even know where Jake Ferguson came from. I think I added him when Dalton Schultz was still there, hoping that Schultz would leave and Jake Ferguson would be the tight end 1 in Dallas, which is actually what ended up happening. So I kind of fell into a really solid tight end 2 as well. And P.S., that is also why I'm stashing Luke Schoonmaker right now, just in case the Cowboys let Jake Ferguson walk after 2025, then Schoon takes over as the tight end 1 and just repeats the whole cycle. But this entire roster construction puzzle was the exact same formula I used in my other Dynasty League that I also went from being 5-9 in 2023 to winning the championship after going 13-1 during the regular season in 2024. Now, mind you, this is a salary cap league, so it plays a little bit differently with contracts expiring, managing the salary cap, all that kind of stuff. But this is a 12-team super flex league with PPR scoring and a 1.5 PPR tight end premium with 10 overall starters. My quarterbacks this year were Joe Burrow and Drake May as my weekly starters with Jameis Winston on the bench. I did have Kirk Cousins for half the year to start the year, but I traded him in like week 7 or 8. Then Drake May just became my weekly starter once he really took over as the Patriots starter. My running backs weren't as plentiful as my other league, but I did kind of make it work with Breece Hall, Joe Mixon, Rico Dowdle, Jordan Mason, Justice Hill, and Isaiah Davis. My wide receivers, though, were Nico Collins, A.J. Brown, Brian Thomas Jr., Jackson Smith-Njigba, Rashee Rice, Cooper Kupp, and Wan'Dale Robinson. And my tight ends were none other than Brock Bowers and Dalton Kincaid. So you can see the overall puzzle is there again. It's just the pieces are slightly different in this league. AJ Brown and Rashee Rice were consistent across both leagues, but instead of having CeeDee Lamb, Amon-Ra St. Brown, and Tyreek Hill, I had Nico Collins, BTJ, and Jackson Smith-Njigba. So again, I very intentionally spent up at the wide receiver position to once again having 5 of the current top 16 wide receivers on Keep Trade Cut, 2 of them being top 8, 3 of them being top 12. I still have a lockdown elite QB1 with Joe Burrow, and hopefully Drake May grows into that high upside QB2 or even perennial top 10 guy. My running backs aren't as deep as my other league, but again, with my receivers being as great as they are, I don't really need them to be. I may do with Breece Hall and Joe Mixon locking down my starting spots every week, and then I kind of lucked out a little bit with Jordan Mason and Rico Dowdle having stretches of relevance as the starters. Plus Isaiah Davis's like 1 to 2 starts for Breece Hall were really nice, and while Justice Hill was never an inspiring start, I at least felt confident that he could get me 5 to 7 points on a regular basis with some upside in high-scoring Ravens games if he were to find the end zone. So he gave me another option throughout the year if I really, really needed it. Oh, and I drafted Brock Bowers at the 1.04 last year, so that more than worked out for me, and I'm probably never ever going to get rid of him because Brock Bowers is that good and also that fun to roster. And I know my examples are in super flex leagues, but this more than works in one quarterback leagues too. In fact, it's probably even more important to really hone in on receivers there because quarterbacks aren't as valuable in one quarterback leagues like they are in super flex leagues. I would still prioritize an elite quarterback in one QB leagues though, someone like Lamar Jackson or Joe Burrow or Jalen Hurts, Jaden Daniels, Josh Allen, even if you can spend that much on a quarterback, because it is really helpful to have that elite weekly starter even in one quarterback leagues. It's also probably a little bit more important to spend up for an elite tight end just because of how the values in one quarterback leagues work. So add that to the list as third on the list behind wide receivers and quarterbacks. But still, running backs are last on the list to get put in place because I just don't think they're valuable, especially the top guys like Bijan Robinson, Jahmyr Gibbs. I mean, these guys are fantastic, but I think you're carrying the wrong kind of value on your roster if you invest into them rather than wide receivers and quarterbacks in superflex leagues. You can find Joe Mixon and David Montgomery and James Conner for super cheap every single year and also find the right handcuffs or late round guys like this year's Bucky Irving or this year's Chase Brown that absolutely smack for you, and you don't need to pay for Bijan Robinson, Jahmyr Gibbs, Devon Achane, or even Saquon Barkley. Just think of it this way from a financial portfolio instead of a fantasy football portfolio. Wide receivers and quarterbacks are your house. They're your real estate. They're very safe assets. They hold their value extremely well, if not even gain value over time, and they're a big part of just your overall net worth. Future draft picks are kind of like your 401k and your retirement savings that make up the other big part of your net worth. They're also very safe. They also usually gain value over time, and they're just really protecting you down the road. The tight end position is kind of like your savings account. You should have one. You should have enough in there just to live in life, but how much you have in there really varies entirely from person to person. But if you have a really big savings account, you have a really nice house, you have a nice 401k, you're probably sitting pretty already. Which is why to me, running backs are like cars. They're flashy, they're fun. Everybody wants to have a super nice car. Some people prefer the tried and true classics. Other people prefer the shiny new hot rods. But at the end of the day, sometimes your car is reliable, sometimes they break down, perhaps for no reason at all, but just randomly bad luck. You need to do regular maintenance and inspections on the quality of your cars. You know that they have a limited shelf life and that you're going to need a new one in maybe a few years when yours starts to show its age. And at the end of the day, cars are just a vehicle to get you from where you need to go, nothing more. I mean, you would never take out a second mortgage on your house to go buy a Corvette, right? You would never pull from your 401k to go buy that new Range Rover just because it looks cool. So why would you sell your elite wide receivers, all of your first round picks, even your elite quarterbacks for top running backs in Dynasty? It just makes absolutely no sense. So my hope after watching this video is that you now are asking yourselves, how can you apply this formula to your leagues? Can you easily move off some elite running backs over to elite wide receivers and then refill your running backs with cheaper guys? Are you going to need to do a quick rebuild for maybe a year or two to get to the point to where you can start buying elite players or even hit on a couple of draft picks? Or do you have all the pieces in place right now that you can begin to go on the offensive? Like I said at the beginning, there are a ton of ways to win in Dynasty, but I believe that my formula from this video is a tried and true method that has worked for me multiple times in multiple different leagues. So try out the formula, give it a shot. Hopefully you guys see the puzzle before you, and now it's just time to put the pieces together to go win some championships in 2025 and beyond.